So welcome to one of the final sessions that I'll be moderating for the UNM Native American Heritage Month. This is hosted by the UNM Health Sciences Center. And I am so fortunate and grateful today to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Frank Chaves. Frank Chaves is from the Sandia Pueblo, and he will also introduce himself, but he is also has an extensive history of work in economic development, including tax policy, land and water resources, and has previously served as the Economic Development Director and Environmental Director for the Sandia Pueblo. He is also currently working, he is appointed to the Sandia Tribal Gaming Commission. So I have known Frank for many years. He is a mentor and a colleague, and has extensive knowledge of this area's history. And so I thought today's session we're going to go ahead and get some perspective on the history of the Bernalillo County Hospital. For those of you who may not really know its history, we'll go ahead and discuss that. And then we'll just have a really great chat about, I'll get to pick Frank's brain a little bit. So if you have questions, go ahead and put that in the chat and we'll get started. So, hi, Frank. I was wondering if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Frank Chaves. I'm of Tiwa descent. My mother is House Pueblo, Tiwa speaking Pueblo. My father is from Sandia Pueblo, also a Tiwa speaking Pueblo. Right now, we're coming to you live from the ancestral lands of the Tiwa people. I'm here at Bow and Arrow, located in Albuquerque, and speaking tonight about the Bernalillo University of New Mexico Hospital, a little bit about its history and a little bit about the history of the area, and a little bit about the I guess the services to the surrounding communities. I guess I'll start out by talking a little bit about the Pueblo people and of the area. The area has been settled for many centuries primarily in the Middle Rio Grande by the Tiwa people. There were a number of pueblos, settlements up and down the Middle Valley. So the area that the University of New Mexico Hospital sits on is an area that was within those territories of the Tiwa people. We first encountered Europeans in about 1540. They came from the south, and they came with their Mexican allies. So our people were some of the first defenders of this Middle Valley and our homes and the livelihood that we derive from the area. As Missy mentioned, I have some experience in resource development, and part of that was land claims, and it's for the Sandia Mountains. We've come to a successful settlement on that land claim, and we have management responsibilities with the United States Department of Agriculture. So that's a little bit about the region. In trying to understand and the history of UNMH, I talked to a few people about their perspectives and their knowledge about the history itself. And one of the individuals I spoke to was my brother-in-law, who attended or who worked with Dr. Ron Lujan of Taos Pueblo, another Tiwa Indian person, Pueblo Indian person. And he was an advocate of Native American health services. One of the issues that he, as I understand, addressed was the history of the hospital and the obligations to Native peoples from from a 1952 document. That document was basically a contract, an agreement between the County of Bernalillo and the federal government. It makes reference to two other documents, which were acts of Congress. One which provided for a transfer of federal land to the county, and also a requirement for and capital, as well as capital for funding for the construction and services that were to be provided to the people in the area. So I found that document very interesting. I actually read it for the first time this year, about a month ago. I read it twice and trying to get a perspective on that agreement and how that agreement has survived in terms of its commitments and obligations by the parties, the County of Bernalillo and the federal government. And it's kind of interesting that that it speaks to this idea of a guarantee of 100 beds and a guarantee of services to Native people. And this agreement was agreement in perpetuity, meaning that the successor entities who were obligated to fulfill the obligations of the federal government and the County of Bernalillo were to continuously fulfill these obligations. These obligations were under a contract, but that contract also, there was also a transfer of land to the county for those purposes. And there was a mention of appropriations for those services. So that's, kind of a takeoff point, I guess, from my perspective in looking at it. In speaking to, and just trying to remember the impressions of the Indian hospital, which is now UNMH, from a couple generations ago, the generations of my mother and father, it was almost like a place to go die. From people thought that that was it wasn't a good place. It was a drab place where you waited for hours for services, and if you were in really dire need of of medical attention, it was not necessarily a good place to be. That was from two generations ago. I recently spoke to a coworker who works in the commission with me, and he has a law enforcement background working in Bernalillo County and Sandoval County. And I asked him his impressions of UNMH today, and he said he understood that it was one of the finest trauma centers in the region, in the nation, that its services for trauma victims were, probably unmatched. And then he talked a little bit about the Laguna Acoma Hospital, or medical facilities just to the west of us here. And he said that those facilities were not even a match for what was found at UNMH, that a person might go there to be stitched up, and but for trauma services and so forth, the UNMH was by far one of the premier facilities in the region. So those are some of the recent perspectives. But going back to the connection, I guess, with this land and the facilities, as I understand, the facilities lay on about 5.3 acres of land that came from the federal government. Now, where the government acquired those lands is, I don't know, but they were ancestral lands, again, of the Tiwa people. So they either acquired them through some mechanism of, I don't know, discovery or whatever you want to call it. But that was part of the deal, so to speak, the contract. the originating contract that allowed the university to grow into a public facility in a public learning facility, as I understand it. Public meaning that it is funded by taxpayers. Taxpayers in the county, taxpayers, I understand, in the state, and federal taxpayers. I happen to be one of those taxpayers. Even though I live on the Sandia Reservation, I pay taxes to, anytime I come into Albuquerque, I'm paying taxes for goods, services, and the like. On my homeland, I pay taxes. I pay taxes in the form of labor and service to my community. To the federal government, I'm always paying taxes for for income taxes and other forms of taxes that the feds collect. So, that's kind of my view, I guess, at this of the history and that 1952 agreement. But I just wonder, in the time of a pandemic, how those services and obligations are playing out today. Those 100 beds, by example, do people really know that those 100 beds were obligated for Native American people? Who ensures that those 100 beds are made available, especially in this time when hospital beds are in a critical shortage with the pandemic across this nation. So that's some of my maybe opening statements and perspectives at this point with regard to UNMH, Bernalillo County Medical Center, the Indian Hospital, and the land that it occupies. Missy?
Thank you. Thank you for that great, good introduction. So yes, I thought it was important as a part of Native American Heritage Month at the university to sort of talk about this history and talk about how UNM is viewed by the neighboring Native communities and the Pueblo communities. So I did some research myself on the 1952 contract. It's available in the university website underneath the Native American Health Services. So I think with the growing movement of universities and other entities doing what you call land acknowledgement, it's important also for the UNM Health Sciences to recognize that we are on the traditional homelands, the Tiwa territory. That history is important to know that exists and that it's still very much alive today. So Frank, I had a question. You mentioned that these are the ancestral lands of the Tiwa. Could you talk a little bit about what activities you still do at the Sandia Pueblo today that are considered part of that? Honoring the Tiwa territory. Could you share a little bit about that? Specifically, you had mentioned hunting. Yes,
as an example, with respect to the land claim in the Sandia Mountains, the mountains have been a source of what people refer to as livelihood, a source of for gathering things like piñon, things like medicine, herbs, also animals, mule deer, for example. So those have been traditional hunting grounds, and they've been important for our culture because many of our ceremonies and songs and reflect that great gratitude for that livelihood, for the livelihood brought us from the earth, basically, the plants, animals, clean air, water, all the things that sustain our life here in the Middle Valley throughout hundreds of years. So those practices continue. Some are adaptations to reflect some of the Catholic influences in our culture. The Catholics oftentimes would demand labor and tribute, I guess, to sustain the missions and the church, the churches that were established from time to time. Sad to say that some of those churches were placed over some of our kivas, some of our gathering places, where our religion and practices were undertaken, and many of those practices were forbidden by the church. So the adaptations for prayer, for example, that are found in our songs, those songs that are really prayers. They reflect what we find in nature, what we pray for. Rain, for example, snow, health of the animals, the health of the river, places that we frequent, that we go to gather things. So, that's the cultural tie remains strong. It remains strong. Some of these practices are open to the public, but they're usually tied to some type of Catholic history or recognition. For example, feast days, Saint Anthony, these are saint days, but they are practiced in ceremonies that are still prayers to the livelihood and for the livelihood that we find from the earth. Even and which kind of goes back to for Missy, where our first meeting. I think that you were either a resident or a student at UNM Hospital, and I came in with one of our traditional healers who was going to visit a patient there who was unfortunately dying, a young man, late 20s, and I said that there was a traditional healer with me, and he will want some privacy. You told me we understand that's something that is understood at UNMH at the time. So that was our first encounter meeting, I believe.
That really was. It was I call it a fortunate meeting, in unfortunate circumstances, but it's true. Yeah. I think even when I was going through my own training at UNM, it's hard to believe how many Native patients that we care for, in all the different, tribes. There's over, 30 tribes in New Mexico, and in UNM we have experience with that. And I think through the COVID pandemic, it's been especially challenging when our hospitals and our staff are under stress. And we did have a large influx of Native patients to the ICU, both here at UNM and at the VA. I think through that stress, it was probably difficult to remember sort of our obligations to the original mission of the foundation of this hospital. But we had to take care of Native patients. And I think through that, through these challenges, we learned a lot. We learned about our strengths, but also some of our shortcomings in terms of providing language interpretation, and learning how to deal with sort of these sensitive issues when patients are going to die, and having those difficult conversations with the community. There is a lot of learning that happened during that time. So thank you for sharing that. And I think you always speak of the book Winter of the Metal People as a book that we need to read to learn more. So that's a really good resource.
Glad you mentioned that. Yes, that was actually a publication of a retired University of New Mexico professor. I think it was archaeology or something. But it's a fictional account of the warfare, or the guerrilla warfare, actually, that took place in around 1540. Earlier on, I mentioned the idea that we were the first, that our Tiwa people were the first defenders of the Middle Valley. And in 1540, the archaeological findings, or the findings from that era, indicate that indeed that there was a conflict, huge conflict that went on between the Spaniards and their Mexican allies from the south, from the deep south. That was almost 100 years, over 100 years before the Pueblo Revolt, which many people, I think, are familiar with, at least that particular encounter, fight for freedom, basically. But this particular encounter between the Tiwa people and the people from Spain, from Mexico, was 100 years before that. And it's a kind of a fictional account of that, identifying individuals who were leaders, war chiefs, bow chiefs, other spiritual leaders, and their role, some of their roles in that conflict. When I asked my daughter about what she thought of the book, she said, "Oh, Dad, I cried because of the outcome and the basically cruel ways of the invaders in how they to kill people and kill them slowly when they found them." So that's part of the history of the area.
Yeah.
So that conflict, waged throughout the area and into the mountains as well. Yes, that's a good book. Winter of the Metal People gives some perspective on a little bit of history.
Yeah. I think I've read part of it, and it's a good it's a good book. It's intense. If anybody reads any of the accounts of like Las Casas and California Indian history and sort of those encounters written, they're intense as a Native person to read, for sure. But I think we all need to read it and to know it. So I'm going to shift gears slightly. So the Sandia Pueblo is about 20 minutes from University. Is that correct? To drive there? Roughly?
Depending upon traffic, yes.
Depending upon traffic.
Roughly.
So what can you speak to? You mentioned that the Indian hospital, the Bernalillo Indian Hospital, was a place that people often refer as a place to die. And that's kind of in my experience, also growing up on the Navajo reservation, that's what you call the hospital in many Native languages, the place where you die. What is the healthcare system of the Sandia Pueblo right now, to your knowledge? You mentioned, I think there's a clinic, but is the UNM hospital, does it still serve as sort of that, for inpatient facility for ICU services for your Pueblo?
I'm not sure, but I do know there's a relationship there. I think it may be one of under a contract to provide services to the clinic. I do not know the details of that agreement, but I believe it is under some type of agreement that there is that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The Pueblo Sandia does have a clinic. It has a dental clinic or dental services, pharmacy, medical clinic services. More recently, it was really a place where our people, that is the people from Sandia, would get their COVID testing and their inoculation or their vaccines. Our leadership made sure that when the vaccines became available, that that our people were vaccinated, and it was part of I guess something that our leadership in going to our traditional council, not necessarily the government council, but the religious leadership, in asking for support for the policies that were going to be put in place for closing off the community from outside people, from people that were not from the community. Basically setting up checkpoints, making sure that only those people that were from Sandia Pueblo would be allowed to enter and leave at that time. So it became, in March of in 2020, it was there was a lot of unknowns about the pandemic, the COVID, but there was knowledge that these types of diseases had visited upon Native people before and took their toll. So I remember you telling me at one time, you said, I hope this one gives our people a pass. And unfortunately, it did not. But the extent of the impact of COVID has been felt in Pueblo communities. I know they've been felt in Navajo communities, and probably Native American communities across the nation. Mm-hmm. But the clinic there itself was the kind of a focal point where we continue to have our routine regular testing done, and but the one thing that our leaders, cultural leaders, religious leaders, elders told us was number one: be thoughtful. Be thoughtful. Remember when you knelt down to take those canes of authority, what you were told and how you need to look out and protect and care for your people. And the other was that, to be kind, and to be thoughtful in this whole process. And I hope those words have been, are reflected in the way, at least our Pueblo has tried to provide for health security of our people, especially in this time. We're fortunate that we have resources that we can provide for that health security.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that sentiment was definitely felt all over Native America, in that Native people, for the most part, were very accepting of following safety protocols and very accepting of vaccination because of the history of smallpox that disseminated communities. And I think those cultural values led to our communities still having some of the highest rates of vaccination in the country. So, in order to protect our people and to protect our elders and future generations to come. So, a couple more thoughts about the pandemic. I know that each Pueblo is a unique, distinct, sovereign, has their own language, their own way they govern themselves politically and traditionally. During this time of COVID, with all the different Pueblos, was there a pooling of resources, or did all the Pueblos mostly sort of operate independently? If you're aware of any of that, was there any collaboration?
There was. I think back in March of 2020, as part of that advice given to the governor and the war chief of the Pueblo, was to be in communication with our sister Pueblos, understand what's going on. There have been old alliances, I guess, old cooperative activities throughout history. But the communication was kind of key to understand what was going on in the other pueblos surrounding us. Many pueblos continue to carry on traditional practices that brought people together in close quarters. And that had an impact on the infection rate and the rate that I think that people experienced the effects of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunate because those ways really require, the people to be close together and to be cooperating towards, towards the objectives of a ceremony, completing those ceremonies and things, and that community practice had to be modified. Funerals, for example, where people, because they had to come into homes and so forth. There was ways to reduce the number of people that would go to those homes and would participate in those ceremonial processes for those that were deceased, for example. We didn't hold our what were called annual feasts in a public way. We still maintained our practices, but they were closed more to the public than ever before, I think, in recent contemporary times. So the practices continued, but how they were done there had to be some adaptations to that.
Mm-hmm.
Even our medicine societies, I was happy that at one of these ceremonies for our whole community, healing ceremony, the whole community, that one of our lead medicine men said, we need to protect our people, get that vaccine, get vaccinated. And that was just great. It took a while, but it did come from our traditional healers.
Mm-hmm. That is so important because many of our people still practice, the traditional healing, traditional medicine, along with the American Western medicine. And also, in my experience for Navajo Nation, once there is an association for traditional healers called the Dene Medicine Man Association, the Hatathis, and they also were very paramount in delivering the message to get the vaccine. So it's very powerful when the traditional healers in the community, advocate for that as well. You had mentioned Dr. Ron Lujan. So he's definitely one of the first Pueblo, if not the first Pueblo, physician at that time from Taos, and which made me think, he is one of the most notable Pueblo physicians. In your perspective, are there many Pueblo, I know you can only speak for Sandia really, but are there many Pueblo physicians or students pursuing health careers in your community that you're aware about?
In Sandia Pueblo's community, not that I'm aware of at this point. I know that there is a veterinarian in Jemez Pueblo, and I understand that's even a tougher field of study. But there is a veteran veterinarian rather in Jemez Pueblo that I'm aware of. Other than that, I'm not much on Western medicine. I try and avoid going to places where they insist you get an X-ray or give you a shot for everything or a pill for this and a pill for that. So I don't keep up on that very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had a few discussions about preventative medicine and getting the vaccine. So I'm going to go back to the history of the hospital in some of the research in honoring this mission. I think what do you think are some ways that the university can continue to honor this mission? What are some ways that, or some ideas from your perspective that we could either improve upon or start to think about? Because in this day, we I think all of us here know the extreme health disparities that exist in terms of chronic disease that afflicts our communities. There's a shortage of physicians. The IHS has a 30% vacancy rate. So we have so many pressing problems. What are some ways that we could do better?
Well, I think knowing its origins, the history. I mean, just understanding the facility, where it's located, it's that history, and that 1952 agreement. I think is important just to understand what perspectives there were at that time at that time. In my understanding is that the all Pueblo Council, I think it's called at the time, actually requested a veto of legislation which would put into process the construction and funding of this agreement between the county and the federal government, and that was a fear of the people being discriminated against, that the access and the services provided by the entities would not necessarily be provided to the Native American people because of the attitudes and of the time. There's, from my understanding, discriminatory attitudes of the time. I think the president at the time finally received a message from the All Pueblo Council to accept or to sign the legislation for this project, based upon further assurances that there would not be discrimination in services and access to these facilities. And more recently, through my understanding is the language of non-discrimination also appears in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which I thought was interesting. Now, I haven't done any fact checking. I don't know if that's the case, but that's my understanding from recent information. Mm-hmm. So, as far as what might be good for successor entities, that this whole idea of these services and and beds and other things of that nature would be in perpetuity as long as this agreement, I guess, existed. And I believe that that agreement still exists. So that would be a good place to start, understanding that history, the history of the hospital and how it was established as a public hospital and as a public educational facility. Speaking of which, I send you, on how obligations are fulfilled, and perspectives of the time. Can you pull up that magazine cover that?
Yes,
you would. I
certainly can.
And this just speaks to, well, that's the 52, the 1952 agreement, the contract itself. But and that contains, as I understand, it's a reference to not just this agreement for services, but there's a transfer of land reference under an act, and then appropriations as well. So that's part of this agreement. The graphic that I would like to show you to show is the magazine cover, and that just goes to the idea of how obligations of the federal government for health and education were fulfilled. And this is just a graphic of handcuffs for toddlers that were hauled off
can you
to.
see it?
Well, I can see it. I don't know if anybody can.
Yeah, everybody else
Okay.
can see it. Do you want to describe? Do you want to tell our viewers what we're looking at?
This is a magazine cover of Indian Country Today. It says, a small artifact in the Haskell University Museum is a chilling reminder of how cruel assimilation was. And basically, this was the federal government's tool, these tiny handcuffs to get children into these educational institutions. And I think institutions is a good word for it, because they were institutions to basically commit cultural genocide, in my opinion, and maybe others. But this is, how a history of how governments fulfill obligations, I guess, treaties and obligations to educate and provide health services to Native communities. But I thought it might lend some perspective. The little hands that are holding the magazine cover are my granddaughter's hands. And if you look kind of in perspective, they would probably fit her. And she's not even 2 years old yet. But I thought it was graphic illustration of tools of the trade, I guess, tools of government in fulfilling their obligations. I've run out of things to say, Missy.
Well,
at this point.
I mean, I definitely think it was good to share that photo because it's true. The government did do atrocious things to Native Americans in this country, and we learn every day. With the boarding schools that my parents went to, that our grandparents went to. They tell us stories about the experience at boarding school. And every day we were finding mass graves, not only in the United States, but also in Canada, which speaks to, our experience with education. And I think those are things that we definitely need to acknowledge. We need to talk about. We need to heal from it. But we also need to carve a new way forward and do things differently. So I'm optimistic for that, Frank. I'm an eternal optimist. So, so in the last few minutes we have here, we have a small group, but I want to open it up for any questions you would like to ask Frank. JP.
Yeah, it's a pleasure meeting you, Frank. I'm JP Sanchez. I serve as, I'm a ER practitioner, emergency medicine physician, and I have the honor of serving as the Executive Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Health Sciences Center. And I'm really a big honor of working with Dr. Begay for now almost 10 years with our medical students. But as many of our communities discuss cultural revitalization, can you give your thoughts on what we can do as a health sciences center, as a hospital, as a medical school to help promote cultural revitalization?
Well, I think recognizing the value of the traditional healers and their knowledge of medicine and how that works. I kind of an example. Let me give you an example of a traditional healer that got a hold of me one time. I had dislocated an ankle, and at a ball game, and it was completely dislocated. And so they carried me over to the side in the dugout, and this man didn't speak a word of English. Just asked me, where I was hurting, and he put my ankle back into place, and then he told me, come see me tonight. And so I went to go see him, and he had prepared cactus. It was a flat cactus. He had placed it in charcoals, and steamed it as well, and then smashed it up. And then he massaged my ankle, and then he took this cactus that he had, smashed and stuff, and wrapped my ankle in it like a cast. And he left the spines in it. I mean, there were still spines in there. So he said, come back in 4 days and we'll, take a look at it. And when he took it off, my ankle was black, right, from all the blood that was inside and everything else. But it healed. I mean, it healed so well. I mean, it was, he just had this knowledge about how to put it back into place, how to take this cactus, this flat cactus. I'm not even sure what they're called in English, but anyway, so this was my experience, and other experiences with these traditional healers, taking things like, oils and things like that for, especially in manipulating muscles and joints and things of that nature. Stomach ailments, I've been told, go out and get this particular plant, get its root, soak it in, water, and take it, drink it, and by gosh, the stomach uneasiness and goes away. They know these things, and these are medicines out of nature, so I think just acknowledging that traditional healing isn't just prayer and song, and it also has a lot to do with how the patient, so to speak, reacts to their words and their prayers and their telling them, that they will be okay, that they will heal. That goes to kind of this idea of relying on your own body to heal itself. It has these abilities to heal itself, but somehow they have to be brought out. They have to be believed in, I guess, for lack of a better word. So these traditional processes, have a lot to do with the mind and the elements around us that will help us heal.
Thank you for
the
sharing.
other thing. The other thing that would be helpful, and Missy asked me about my knowledge of medical students and so forth, but I think that I think it's important that there be individuals like Missy in the Pueblo community as well. Dr. Lujan was a great example of an advocate that was a medical doctor as well, who understood medicine and medical services, but also understood the importance of being able to advocate for his community. And that can be only done if we have more medical students, Native American medical students, Native American medical healers, and so forth in Pueblo country. So anything that can be done to be an advocate of that and teaching your skills as the medical doctor.
To that, can I ask one more question? One of the things that I've thought a lot about, and it would be great to get your perspective. Historically, Black colleges and universities have existed for over 100 years, and they're the largest producer of African American and Black medical students in this country. There's 4 medical schools in Puerto Rico, where both of my parents are from, and the 4 medical schools in Puerto Rico also are the largest producer of Hispanic Latino medical students. Reflections and thoughts on moving towards more medical schools that support, Native American medical schools, just like HBCUs or the 4 medical schools in Puerto Rico. What are in your mind, the pros and cons of such an idea?
I think it's a great idea to be able to have a focus on a particular group of people who may not have as many professionals in that area. UNMH, its history says it's a public facility, public health facility, also a public learning facility. I think that University of New Mexico Hospital, with its connection now to university, would be a great location for a medical school, that has a focus on training Native American physicians. However that comes about, I don't know a whole lot about scholarships and programs, because I funded my way. I worked my way through school, so through UNM. I'm a graduate of UNM, the Anderson School of Management. So, but I basically, my wife and I basically funded my college education. So scholarships are a great idea. A learning center like UNM that has that part of its mission to recruit, to train, to support, to mentor Native American students would be a fine way to honor that 1952 agreement, the land, those obligations. I think that would be one of the best things that the university could do.
Mm-hmm. I agree. The Bernalillo County Indian Hospital was one of the first training facilities, which led to the development of the School of Medicine. And so I think that would be an excellent way to continue to make sure that Native students and residents get to train there. And also with what our colleagues are experiencing at the Indian Health Service hospital next door in Albuquerque, I heard they recently lost one of their residency programs that provided a lot of support to the community, and our communities had their primary care providers there, and they're struggling. So I think it's not a question of if it's needed or not. So we're at the end of time. I know Frank I know Frank, and you can talk to him all night, but we'll have to invite you back, Frank. So just a couple of comments from the chat. Beautiful words, Frank. Thank you. From Dr. Burns, from Dr. Roybal. Thanks, Frank and myself, for sharing this important history and for important conversation this evening. Thank you so much for being here, Frank. I'm curious about your thoughts on any particular turning points, individuals, or actions that were key in transforming UNMH from the institution that it was a couple decades ago to the state-of-the-art institution that it is now. So I think you've answered some of that from Jenny. And I just want to say thank you, Frank. Thanks again for being with us. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Good night.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
How do I get off of this?
Frank, great job. You just go ahead and just push leave meeting.
Okay. I have my technical advisor here.
Thank you. Thank you as well. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.